So now I'm going to briefly give an overview of some of the methodological refinements and improvements we've made to the agriculture inventory this year. So as Stephen mentioned, when we look at emissions broken down on a sectoral basis, agriculture represents over a third of the emissions we're reporting for 2019, so it's an important sector in that context. And of those emissions, the majority of them are livestock-related greenhouse gas emissions. So therefore, we've focused this year on making some improvements and refinements to reflect up-to-date data and science on these. So just first of all, just a quick overview of what we mean by livestock-related emissions. These are broken down to two main categories, and the first are direct emissions of methane, or CH4, as a result of the digestive processes of livestock, particularly ruminant livestock such as cattle and sheep. These are a function of the physical characteristics of the animal, as well as the quality and quantity of food intake. A second important group of emissions arises from the manure from the animals and the storage and management of that manure. First of all, there are methane emissions that arise from anaerobic decomposition of the manure. And also nitrous oxide emissions can arise both directly and indirectly from the nitrogen in the manure, and these are dependent on the duration and the type of storage of the manure. So basically, why have we updated the agriculture inventory methodologies? These were motivated by a couple of reasons. First of all, there's been a change in recent years in farming practices, and they continue to evolve on the ground, and we want to be able to reflect that. So and new data sources, so we constantly want to keep up to date with that, and so therefore we've followed that. And also secondly, going forward as well, to recognize and accurately quantify the emissions mitigation measures that are starting to come online, and that a lot of farmers are doing on the ground, or starting to do, so that these are reflected in national inventory numbers. So what have we updated this year? First of all, we have updated our methane emissions models, which were developed by Chagask, to the latest versions. So this work was undertaken by Chagask Moore Park and funded by the EPA and published in 2019 to reflect the latest scientific knowledge about methane emissions. Secondly, new data sources have come online, particularly from Department of Agriculture, Food and Marine surveys on crude protein content in concentrate feeds and trends, which are an important determinant of emissions. And thirdly, from the Chagask National Farm Survey, this also has been expanded in recent years to gather more granular data on manure management practices and the uptake of new technologies such as low emission slurry spreading, which can reduce emissions. So just to look at how the trends have changed and how we want to represent these changes in inventory. If we look at a timeline of concentrate feed usage, which is the blue graph here, over time, there has been an increase in feed usage on a per cow basis overall, and this has been driven by increased activity, and particularly in outputs of milk and such like. This has been offset somewhat by also a reduction, though, in the crude protein concentrate proportion of the feed, which has also impacts on the nitrogen availability for and therefore nitrous oxide emissions, so which is a positive effect. So we wanted to be able to reflect these changes in our inventory, which we have. Also, in terms of livestock housing, we see a trend towards reduced numbers of cattle that are outwintered. This is driven mainly by grant aid programs under the nitrates program in 2006, and also changes in the number of days to pasture. So for suckler cows, there's been a reduction, but for dairy cows, here you can see there's been an increase. So these all feed into our models. Finally, also in terms of the management of manure, the percentage of slurry-based housing on the left for dairy cows has always remained very high at nearly 95%, but there's also been an increase in slurry-based housing for sucklers and other cow category, beef cattle categories. And on the right, then we also show examples of the uptake of low emission slurry spreading, which is a technique to reduce emissions, and this has seen a fivefold increase from a low base, admittedly in 2003, but we expect for that trend to continue to expand, especially since derogation farms under the nitrates directive will be required to take up this technology. So all in all, there's been various trends which have a positive and or negative effect on emissions levels, so we've incorporated them into our inventory this year. So this again is what Stephen showed you earlier, our time series of emissions inventories from 1990 to 2019. The overall trend is the same despite these changes in sort of absolute numbers with these refinements. We're seeing a general trend of upwards since 2011 in emissions, with a peak in 2018, which Stephen explained was for particular reasons related to the drought of that year and increased concentrates fed and liming and fertilizer use. So if I just drill down a little bit into the figures on a per cow basis, just to see what's driving these emissions increases in recent years, we can see that on the left there's a graph of methane emissions per cow over the past 20 years, and as you can see, there's been an upward trend in dairy cow emissions, whereas a level or slight decrease amongst other non-dairy cows. And similarly, a similar trend is seen for nitrogen excretion rates per cow on the right, which again in orange, the dairy cows are going up, whereas there's a significant decrease in for other suckler cows. So the decreases in suckler cows represent the fact that we're able to capture some of the efficiency gains, things like the reduced crude protein content in diets, which are helping to reduce emissions. And as you can see in the grey figures represent our old, using the old methodology. So we're able to capture the reduced nitrogen output from suckler cows, whereas for dairy cows, numbers continue to increase on a per cow basis, but this is related to the increased output of milk on a per cow basis, which I'll discuss here further, which counteracts sort of the efficiency gains that we're seeing generally. If we look on the left, you can see how the milk yield per cow has been increasing, the average milk yield over the past 20 years, quite considerably, but also on the right, the milk solids content, which is the fat and protein percentage of the milk, has also been increasing. So this, by having increased output, you're going to get increased emissions, which I'll illustrate here. So here we see on the left again methane, and on the right nitrogen excretion rates expressed relative to milk yield per cow. So there's a strong correlation between emissions and milk yield, and this is understandable considering emissions are a byproduct of the metabolic processes in the cow that are required to produce the milk. So for every unit of milk that you produce, there will be byproducts in that process. And with these methodologies, we're able to capture things that affect that, such as the increased feed intake in recent years. You can see in 2018 and 2019 there was increased feed concentrates over previous years used, and this has driven increased emissions. But to counteract that, efforts such as reducing the crude protein content of the feed can somewhat mitigate that by resulting in less, for example, nitrogen available to produce nitrous oxide emissions. Now, overall, that's just a brief summary of what we've done to update our methodologies, but to return to our original motivations for doing this, in terms of more accurately affecting or reflecting what's happening on the ground. We have the new methane models from Chagas, which represent the latest science on that front, but also much more detailed data streams on housing and diets, manure management, and slurry spreading practices to inform our inventories. So taken together, we can be more confident that it's a more accurate representation of the real world, what's happening on the ground. And secondly, going forward, as we see this ramp up and increase of emissions mitigation techniques by farmers, we are better placed to capture that data and to reflect it in national inventories. For example, as low emission slurry spreading techniques become more widespread, or altered dietary changes, they can be captured in the inventory, and other processes that are listed in the Chagas MAC curve, or marginal abatement cost curve analysis, which you can find on the Chagas website for details of the types of mitigation measures that are coming on board. And overall, that's just a brief run through it, and I'd like to thank you for your attention.